Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are. I'm Jeffrey Goldberg. I'm the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, and thank you for joining us in the first episode of The Way Forward. This is a new initiative that we at The Atlantic are hosting with our partners in this, Chatham House, the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and Emerson Collective, which is also the majority owner of The Atlantic, the magazine I edit. We hope that this partnership will contribute something to the global discussion about where we are and some of the challenges that lie ahead. Just a quick note, we're going to take some questions, so please ask your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to incorporate them. This is going to be a little bit of coronavirus speed dating that we got going on here. We have a bunch of very, very interesting people to talk to in the next hour, so keep your questions short. We won't get to all of them, but keep them short and on topic, and we'll try to incorporate them into the conversation. And also in your question, tell us where you're writing from. We have a lot to discuss. So I want to just jump right in, and I want to welcome first Gordon Brown, of course, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and now the United Nations Special Envoy for Global Education. Prime Minister, are you there? Yes, you are.
Yes, indeed.
Welcome, welcome. We are so technologically adept; it's unbelievable. Thank you for joining us. Let me just ask you very, very specifically. I think that the framing of this question is the frame that many billions of people have around the world, which is, what do you envision right now to be the clearest pathway forward out of the mess we're in? And you could break that question into two parts: the US, UK, Europe, developed countries, and then I know you've been speaking a lot about issues facing developing countries, sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere. So if you can take those in two, please do.
Well, in sync with the mission of Chatham House, Emerson, Atlantic, and Peterson, I think my theme is that global problems require global solutions. And I would say that such is the mismatch between the boldness of national economic measures and the frugality and feebleness of the global measures that have been taken to deal with this crisis, that we're actually acting as if we've got one hand tied behind our back. We cannot genuinely say at the moment we're doing whatever it takes to solve this health and economic crisis. All we can say is that as individual governments lacking global coordination, we're doing the best we can. And it does remind me of the 1930s and of protectionism and of the lack of leadership then. Churchill said that leaders were resolved to be irresolute, adamant for drift, solid for fluidity, all-powerful for impotence. And Keynes went on to say that politics in his generation was the survival of the unfittest. So we have a real problem, I think, about the lack of global coordination, which is going to prolong this crisis. It may mean that this crisis cannot end properly. It certainly means we cannot fully eradicate the disease that we're facing without coordination. Now,
so are you talking about increased globalization? Because that's not exactly the drift of events in recent years and certainly recent days.
I would say there are two urgent challenges that we've got to realize we face together. The first is the health challenge, and there cannot be a proper exit strategy without global cooperation. Let me just illustrate this. The search for a vaccine has got to be funded. Now, it may come out of one country, out of one inventor, out of one company. But that's not enough. It's got to be scaled up, developed, mass manufactured, equally distributed. It's got to be available in every continent. And that requires a level of global cooperation and a sharing of resources and a funding of the poorer countries that is simply not there at the moment. Take the other issue that we're facing at the moment, capacity in testing equipment, ventilators, personal protective health equipment. We're competing with each other for a very limited share of capacity when this is a synchronized crisis and we are needing the same equipment simultaneously almost everywhere. What we should be doing is building up by a coordinated plan the global capacity to have the testing equipment, to have all the medical equipment we need. And instead of fighting each other, we should be concentrating on building capacity. Right. And then take the third problem, which again requires global cooperation. And we've really got to think of this as a practical answer to a practical problem, not some abstract debate between globalists and nationalists. if we are to prevent a second and third and fourth wave of this virus coming into the countries that are now experiencing it, we have got to help the underdeveloped health systems of the world cope. We've got to help those countries that have got no social safety nets and can't practice stay-at-home policies, social distancing, not even hand washing in some cases where water and sanitation is so poor. Now, if we do not help these countries, then they will be carriers of this disease back into our own countries. And so the measures that have been announced at the moment are so inadequate to deal with what is probably a $2.5 trillion requirement. Debt relief, 15 billion out of 2.5 trillion. IMF and World Bank resources, it's not the heads of these institutions, they're doing the best. The shareholders have not released what should be around $1 trillion of resources to the IMF and World Bank. And then, of course, special drawing rights, the creation of new international money. So in each case, there is no proper exit strategy without global cooperation. And the global cooperation we need has got to recognize both the flaws in previous attempts at cooperation and the opportunities that now exist. You've got medical, scientific, research cooperation across continents, but we don't have the intergovernmental cooperation that can fund that effort and can back it up.
Let me ask you this, is the problem, is a core problem we're facing today that this problem that we're facing, the global pandemic, is simply too large to get our hands around? Or are we facing a crisis of bad leadership?
No, we could go to the moon, and we were able to do, we were able to abolish a whole series of
We'll talk about the leadership question.
Diseases. And so this is a question of willpower. And if you look at it this way, what are the ways we've chosen to try and organize this world to deal with problems like this in the past? Now, whether it's dealing with pandemics or climate change or nuclear proliferation or inequality and sustainable development goals and so on and so forth, we've tried through the principles that govern the Washington Consensus. That is a neoliberal sort of economic management that is applied to just about every country. Now, the Washington Consensus is not even supported in Washington anymore, as you know. Then we've tried with America first, India first, China first. That's roughly where we are at the moment. Russia first, every country for themselves. But you know perfectly well, that cannot solve a pandemic. That can't deal with climate change. That can't deal with inequality when you're dealing with tax havens, for example. It can't deal with nuclear proliferation. Then people say, well, it's China and the USA, one world, two systems. But you know perfectly well that just as in the Cold War, the countries will operate according to what is their vested interest and perhaps ignore all these global problems. We have got to find a way of practical, day-to-day, if you like, issue-to-issue cooperation so that we can actually deal with problems as they exist. We've got a medical problem that is global and can't be solved without global action. We've got an economic problem that is as big as the 1930s, as sudden as any crisis that has hit us, more casualties than often in many wars. And we, even with a 15 trillion stimulus, because there is a lack of global coordination, even when you add up this attempt at underpinning the world economy, it is not going to be enough. And we face a decade and perhaps more of secular stagnation, Larry Summers' phrase, a 1930s phrase coming back to us, if we do not find a way of cooperating together. You need a coordinated fiscal, monetary, central bank stimulus. We are at stage one of this crisis, dealing with employment protection. Stage two will be getting the economies back to growth, and that will need coordinated action.
Let me ask you, before we go to one or two questions from our audience, let me ask you one other thing on this leadership question. And pardon me if it sounds parochial, I am sitting in Washington, but is what we're dealing with here a crisis of American leadership? The world has become accustomed, for better and sometimes worse, but often better, since the close of World War II, the notion that the President of the United States will somehow organize the world community to a collective response to a problem. President Obama did this most recently with Ebola.
I don't think anybody doubts that globalization is leaderless at the moment. And you can see that the G7, the G20, even the UN Security Council can't even meet and discuss these issues properly because of the tensions between the different countries. But there is also an ideological issue here about what we've assumed to be the way we manage things. And if you look at the assumptions, if you like, BC, before the COVID-19, the balance between risk and security was all wrong in just about every country. We were taking risks and we didn't understand that we were completely unprotected against a pandemic, against poverty and unemployment, which has resulted from it. We assumed a kind of market fundamentalism that suggested that if you just left everything to markets, public bad, private good, then everything would work itself out. And now we're finding that government is not just the lender of last resort, it's the insurer of last resort, it's the provider of last resort. And I think we assumed a sort of narrow, self-interested individualism and didn't understand that a threat that others faced could easily become a threat that we faced. And we could only help ourselves by helping other people at the same time. So there is a sense of having to learn that in the management of this interdependent, interconnected, integrated world, we have to find a better way of working together. So it's not just a failure of individuals, it's a failure to recognize that you've got to go beyond the Washington consensus, beyond the America First nationalism that's gone global, and beyond this idea of one world, two systems. You've got to find a way, even if it's just issue by issue, even if it's just pragmatic, without ideology behind it, you've got to find a way of working together.
Let me ask you a short question and get a short answer from you. You've talked about this, that you've used this term vaccine nationalism. Just define that, and what makes you so scared of this?
Well, I think it was rumored that President Trump had tried to buy up a German vaccine and simply for the use of the United States of America. I mean, everybody, I think, should be clear that while every one of us wants that vaccine to be available to us, our family, our locality, and our country, you cannot eradicate this virus without that vaccine being available to all. And that's why so much is being done by the scientific and the medical community to coordinate efforts to produce this vaccine and then to mass manufacture it, but they need money behind it. You're not going to be able to equitably distribute this vaccine unless you deal with international patent laws, unless you deal with the privileges of particular companies and countries, and unless you deal with the very difficult task of manufacturing the same vaccine in a host of different countries simultaneously, so it's available to everybody at roughly the same time. And that is a problem of international cooperation that really the governments of the world should be facing up to, and not just the scientists and the medics of the world.
All right. Let me ask you in the couple of minutes that we have left, we have a couple of questions from our audience. From Laurie Goering, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, from the Thomson Reuters Foundation. How much does the way forward from this crisis, COVID-19 crisis, have to take into account another fast approaching threat, climate change impact?
Absolutely. I mean, each of the problems that I'm identifying that are attached to this crisis are as relevant if you look at the climate change crisis. That the ways we have of governing the world, of making agreements, is not working. So we've got a climate change agreement that's based on a treaty that assumes that everybody has got a will to reach a particular target, but there are no obligations on them to set national targets that do so. They can set their own national targets. There's no ability of us to have an agreement on what targets each country should make and meet that are suitable for the world. So climate change reveals exactly the same kind of problem, that you cannot solve this by a Washington consensus approach or by nationalism or by just China and America getting together. We have to find a better way of working together where we agree on targets that actually become binding on each of us. But you know, when you're talking about the way forward, I'm not trying to suggest that this is the only problem we've got. I mean, the relationship between the individual and the state, between the public and the private sector, between market and society, all these things are going to change as a result of this crisis. The social contract is going to have to be rewritten. It does not fit the needs of the times, particularly when people realize that they're not prepared to risk everything and find themselves either vulnerable to medical diseases or alternatively to poverty and unemployment.
Well, you say it has to be
doing of that.
Will it? But will it be rewritten?
Well, that's the question.
I mean, what do you think right now? I mean, do you think that this is going to be 2 years from now, we're going to look back at this period as a bad blip, and then we're going back to the way things were? Or do you think this is going to cause some?
This is not a global crisis in the ordinary sense. This is a crisis of globalization. This is when we've had a wake-up call that unless we find a way of cooperating better and working together, we will be besieged by problems. Nuclear proliferation. How many more countries are considering proliferating? Climate change, inequality and the poverty, tax havens, and the inability of us to control the loss of money from public exchequers and revenues lost to public services. These are all problems that are coming up to hit us. And unless we find a better way, even if it's just issue by issue of cooperating, we will not be able to do anything other than just struggle along at best and perhaps remain in crisis at worst. Right. Secular stagnation is what we're facing on the economy, but a world that is fragile, a world that is not at peace with itself, is also something that is coming out of this crisis unless we do something about it. So I'm aware that it's a matter of choice, remember. I'm saying we should, and we're going to have to review the relationship between individual and state, the social contract, between public and private sectors. We've got to understand that we can't simply rely on markets for everything anymore. But these are choices that this generation has to make. And I believe that these choices should be before us now. And groups like this discussing these issues can realize that we have to look at the social contract. We've got to look at the role of government, the responsibilities of nation states, and their role in the world. If we don't look at these now, then we'll have failed to do what we should have done after 2009. And I wanted to do was look again at the way we structure our international relations.
Right. Well, Mr. Prime Minister, we thank you very much for joining us. We know that you have to go to a meeting in another part of your house, probably in a couple of minutes. But we wanted to thank you very much for joining us today. Thanks so much.
No, it's good to talk to you. Thank you very much.